Welcome to the HR on the Offensive podcast, brought to you by Lace Partners. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to the latest HR on the Offensive podcast. It's me, Chris Howard, back again on this Thursday, on which we release our podcasts. Today we are going AI again. I'm sure there's plenty of people, in fact, I know I've been to events where people have rolled their eyes when they're thinking about AI because it's a bit of a buzzword. But as some of the research that we're going to be talking about from one of our friends and organizations that we are friendly with will explain, people are talking about it for a reason, because it is significant, and the way in which the world of work is evolving is going to have an impact in the AI space. So you can't ignore it at your peril. I don't really want to waffle too much before I introduce my guests for today, though, because we are going to be talking AI in HR. I will start with the laces that are joining me. Charlie Frost, how you doing, man? You all right?
Good, thanks, Chris. How are you doing?
Yeah, not too bad. You're our resident AI expert, so of course I'm dragging you kicking and screaming onto today's pod.
Yep, I look forward to another one.
Yeah, certainly do. And of course, a man that if he hears the word AI in the office, he's going to come running because he is a very nosy Parker indeed. Aaron, how you doing? Had to get you on, didn't we?
Hey, Chris. Wouldn't miss it for the world. Love this stuff.
Lovely. Yeah, me too. Me too. And the special guest. So we have got David Wilson, who is the CEO of Fosway Group. David, how are you, sir?
I'm fine, thank you. Nice to be here.
Yeah, it's lovely to have you on. It's lovely to have you on. Now, we're going to talk a little bit around some of the research that you guys have been putting together in the AI, Fosway's AI in HR research, which, as we were talking about just before we went live, is an ongoing labour of love, I guess, because this space is constantly evolving. Before we get into the detail of that, we are also going to talk about an event which the three of you hosted a few weeks ago now with some CPOs. We're going to get a little bit of a general overview as to some of the interesting discussions there, but we do have to do the fundamentally different question. I'm going to give our guest David a bit of a breather, and I'm going to quiz Charlie and Aaron first so that he can get his thoughts in. But of course, at the time of recording, it's really hot outside. It's something like 30 degrees, I think, or it's going to be close to it over the next day or two. So, Aaron, I'm going to start with you. Any tips for our wonderful listeners on keeping cool?
I think if anyone has driven down the motorways at all recently, they will have seen dogs with their heads out the windows, tongues flapping in the air. So that's my advice. I think if you want to stay cool, stick your head out of a car window.
That is not a recommendation which we completely endorse here at Lace Partners, and any insurance problems that could come as a result of people sticking their heads out of windows going 70 miles an hour, we can't be held liable or responsible for. That's the legal bit. How are Charlie?
Mine's going to be a little bit more conventional, but I'm a coffee fan, so to stay cool on a day like today is iced coffee is my way to go.
Iced coffee, like it. So, David, you can pick one of those two if you want. You can have iced coffee, you can stick your head out of the window, or you can give our wonderful guests, one of our listeners, any advice on keeping cool.
Yeah, that's a very metro answer, Charlie. Having iced coffee, iced frappe, whatever it is. I would have said normally move to the UK because actually we only get about 3 days of sunny a year, don't we, etc. To be honest, I haven't got a good answer. I hardly ever get to see daylight seemingly when I'm working, so I don't get to. It might be cool. It might be hot outside. I suppose one thing is I work and live in the Cotswolds in a farmhouse, and I'm currently in a stone barn that has very thick walls on it. So that's another way of keeping cool. There's to stay locked away in that.
Nice. I like it. Get yourself a big house with nice big thick walls. Okay. So Aaron, we did this event. I was hoping you could just give our listeners maybe just a minute or two on what we talked about at the event. I mean, I've kind of framed it as AI and HR, but just maybe pluck out one or two bits that you thought were interesting and tell our listeners a little bit about the event that we run. And then Charlie, anything that you would like to add on to that would be grand.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Chris. It was about 3 weeks ago or so, I think we ran the event, so still quite recent. And I guess we brought together a few of our clients, CPOs, and some of their trusted teams into a room to talk about AI. And I think the first thing was there was a lot of interest from people to come along to that session. I think certainly one of my takeaways was that there's a very strong awareness of the impact of AI in HR and need to understand this better, paired with, quite frankly, a very early stage of take-up of change around AI in HR at this stage. I think people don't know quite where to start, how to get moving on this, how to make it sustainable. And that was a lot of where the discussion ended up, around sort of the pragmatic steps to move forward. And David shared some of the research that we just talked about with that group. We got some great discussion going around the implications of that. But I think certainly AI in HR, if you're not talking about it as an HR professional, you need to be. It's happening. You need to get your policies aligned, your data ethics aligned, regulation, which I know Charlie has a very strong passion for, and I'm sure we'll talk about on this pod. But also you need to think through, where are you going to get the most value? Which elements are going to drive the most value? Because that technology is pretty much out there now and ramping up fast for people. And if you haven't thought about it, then your organization will probably impose something on you from another part of the organization as it moves forward. So it was a good discussion from that perspective. Certainly one I think we will repeat with different groups over the next year as well, because I think this cry out for how do we get started was probably my big takeaway.
Lovely. Charlie?
Just drawing on that final point from Aaron, actually, I think one of the biggest takeaways, and it's a theme we've seen in other conversations with clients, but also in other research that we've conducted, is that there is this silent majority within the HR space where there is this interest in AI and their awareness of the impact, but all at a similar stage of just exploring what it looks like for their organization, maybe exploring or looking into existing tools or AI features within their own systems. But very few organizations are really powering ahead, looking at implementing something dedicated, or they are really have robust plans in place for what AI looks like for now, today, but also for the next few years. So I think that's the big takeaway that we're seeing, is that there is this big silent majority, and a lot of people are in a similar boat, but they're starting to think about it, which is the right thing to be doing at this stage.
Yeah, David, I guess just to bring you in on this, because obviously you co-hosted it with Aaron, I'll give you a little bit of a free swim, actually. Anything that you can pick out that was interesting from either what the delegates talked about, but then also what I'd like to do is to get your thoughts on what you're seeing in the market, some interesting maybe trends that we're starting to see. So a bit of an open question to kick us off for you.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I mean, there's a tsunami of noise, isn't there, about AI? It's all pervasive for almost every aspect of our lives, actually, not just to do with work-related stuff. But and obviously from a Fosway point of view, I mean, we do a massive amount of research on an ongoing basis. We're constantly, because of the 9 grids, talking to vendors across the whole spectrum, from cloud HR to talent, recruiting, learning, and so on. And we usually count the seconds before we get the AI stories, right? And one of the things I think that Charlie was talking about, sort of a lot of people are very early on in where they're at. But in reality, there are certain areas where actually AI is actually quite mature around things like personalized recommendations around things, and skills is an area where there's been quite a huge focus on it. But I think it's generative AI that really has put not the cat amongst the pigeons, but probably a rampaging herd of wild cats, if you like. And it's really, really massively changed the whole agenda. And obviously the level of awareness around the topic is very high. The level of understanding around the topic is incredibly low, actually, generally, we find within organizations. And often we also find that I think the HR function is often concerned, or generally it's often quite conservative around the adoption of new technology. And there is a threat, around that, not just in terms of the HR function itself, possibly, but an understanding of will we do something that effectively creates bias, or do we create things that are unethical, or how do we do this in different parts of our business where we have workers' councils and all these kinds of things? I think there are so many questions around it, let alone basic, what is the EU or the US going to do around governance and regulation and everything else? So we're definitely still early days. There are certain areas where pockets of maturity and certain parts of the HR ecosystem where I think the use of AI has become quite systemic already, but on a general level, it definitely isn't. And I think most corporates that we see are still trying to understand it. You're right. There's possibly another factor is that many of the vendors are pushing faster before they get controlled and stopped. And I also think that there is within all of this, we have to work out some very basic questions. Ultimately, what is it we want this to be able to really do and deliver? How do we measure that? The value that we get from it? Who pays for it? It's a really interesting question. There's a reason why NVIDIA was valued at X trillion dollars or whatever it was because it makes chips to run this stuff. Who's paying for all of those chips? That's the question, right? And so on. So there's lots and lots of questions within there that we still to address. The cat is out of the bag. All right. So there isn't a way we're going to go back towards a situation where we don't have to think about this stuff. And from a corporate point of view, I think how we understand where we want to best apply it and how we manage that process in a sensible way.
Yeah. Can I ask a quick question? And then I'll get actually Aaron and Charlie, I'll get your views in a second. But David, I'll just stick with you for a second, because when I've spoken to people, when we've run things like our shared services forum, when you talk about AI, a lot of people, they almost go down the route of, well, yeah, we're using it for recruitment. We're using it to help to screen candidates, whatever it is. And you've talked about, there are biases there. And I know on some of the research that you've done as well, some of the big areas where people are looking at it at the moment, there's a really interesting word cloud you did was around learning or recruitment. But I want to tap into this skills stuff because we've got a campaign which is launching. Well, at the time that we release this, it will have already launched called Becoming Skills Powered. It's about organizations really emphasizing skills-based organizations rather than having organizations that are more traditionally mapped out, job titles and job functions. It's skills for particular tasks. Will AI have a significant impact in that skills arena? Particularly when I start to think about the potential with things like internal sort of talent mapping of skills within our business. So I just want to get some general initial thoughts, and then I'll jump onto Aaron and Charlie to give me some thoughts as well. But David, just any thoughts on that skills side, please?
Yeah. And I mean, I think skills, if you've been around the HR and learning markets for any length of time, you know that we've tried this before, right, with skills, tried to move towards skills being things, sort of almost the language of talent, effectively. I think it's not that AI will have an impact on it. I think AI is probably the only way in which we can make it work. And that's the game changer this time. I mean, in the past, we've had to go through very expensive consulting processes or buying off the shelf libraries around what skills might mean and so on, none of which, of course, are tailored or contextual to your organization. We then tried to work out what skills people have, got them to self-assess it, a manager assess it, and all these kind of things. Every one of those we've turned off, because it's just the amount of work is huge and the amount of value that we extracted from it, because we typically had to oversimplify it in order to make it an achievable program of activity, made it useless. It really, the amount of real value we generated out of it. AI, of course, is a total game changer for that. It can do a lot of that analysis. It can also, both on an individual organization level, as well as obviously looking at future trends around things, all the things we can't do, let's make somebody's job, give somebody a career recommendation based on data that's 20 years old around what roles and careers are going to exist in the future. I mean, what's the point of that? So I think AI has already proven that it is a game changer around the area around skills. And I think the challenge is doing skills in a complex organization is really, 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 really challenging. And there's so many different pieces of the equation there. No individual function. Learning L&D used to thought it owned skills as a topic and has realized it absolutely doesn't. And in some ways, it's a junior partner in the conversation. And so definitely that is an area where it is a game changer. And I think a lot of the skills intelligence and et cetera is very dependent on the use of AI. And some of that has become systemically adopted in what I would call leader and early adopter organizations, definitely not in the laggard ones, right? So absolutely, that's an area to pick out. But that's not the same as, again, the Gen AI story is is the big elephant in the room, right? That has changed the equation completely. And I think most people now, when you talk about AI, that's what they're thinking around Gen AI.
I do want to get back to the Gen AI, but Aaron, I don't want to cut you out because I can see you shuffling around and you see.
Well, no, it's interesting because I'm glad David brought it back around to the Gen AI, because that's where I originally wanted to jump in. But if I can, let me just jump in on that point just to follow on from David, and I'll come back round on skills. So, because I think we had this debate and discussion when we met with that group of CPOs the other day. I think there's a risk that HR professionals, we focus on what AI will do for our function and the way we deliver our services. Whereas I think the real story here is, will your business survive generative AI, and will it be, what shape will it be as it goes through that? And that is all about the impact on people. And therefore, as an HR professional, you've got to understand the generative AI agenda for your business sector. And for some sectors, that's massive in terms of change, whether it's insurance or computer science type environments. Those will shift significantly through Gen AI. So I'm with David on this. I think that you can't have a conversation around AI without talking about the Gen AI impact on business. And if you're the HR professional involved in those sectors, you've really got to understand, because it's going to shift it, and it will be the competitive difference between organizations that excel and those that disappear from the rosters in the next 10 years. Just coming back round on skills piece, because I've been with David. I've been around that block a few times on skills. I've run those projects that you have the high hopes, but then the administrative nightmare and overhead fails it, right? And it's really hard to do. So I'm excited about what AI can bring to us in terms of the skills piece. And I think that point about using AI to help us really sort of infer and predict skills, to use external data sets to really sort of give us an insight on skills requirements and skills changes, is just a game changer as well. It's going to be quite interesting, though. I think there's some pragmatic elements. We talk to people quite a lot around this, which is most people in larger organizations probably have 2 or 3 systems. So they have a core HR record, they will have a learning system, maybe even a performance management system that's different, and each would claim at the moment to have some form of skills capability, some of which would say they're AI powered, some of which wouldn't. But you've got to make some decisions around which one you're going to back. You can't have all 3 or 4 as records. So you've got to, how's it all going to fit together and make it work? So there's some real pragmatic stuff that goes behind some of this as well, which is really exciting as well, about, choices you've got to make.
David?
One of the dangers actually of doing this within, we're obviously very specifically talking within an HR and people context. And I think sometimes we, as Aaron implied, we overly focus then on that HR and people function. And I think the bit we forget about is work. What do you do as a business? How will that be changed by what's going on? Who do you therefore now need to employ? Is a question that then comes afterwards. And what skills do you need those people to have? And the pace of change obviously is huge here, but it's just a shifting target. Would you want to start a manually, a translation business now in the modern world? It feels like this. And there's so many things that are going to get changed. And what's interesting is there are a lot of organizations that we're talking to and where we're tracking them, and their HR function, they're a leader, would be perceived as that. And they are looking at a lot of this stuff, but maybe their business has gone off and already invested or is investing 10 or 100 times that amount. One company we know where they've effectively committed $1 billion globally to and that's not their HR function that's doing that. That's their business. That's their operations. They're completely looking at how they change the way they operate, etc. And obviously that has a massive impact on work and the workforce. And that brings probably back to an interesting point when we come back to the skills discussion. The one thing you can pretty much absolutely guarantee when you look at the skills assessment from all these different parts of the HR portfolio is the one bit that we're not looking at is work. What we're looking at is HR process or learning activity or recruiting activity and the skills we need for that. What we haven't actually, when we look at evidence of skill, one of the things we're not looking typically is work outcome. And for my mind, if I'm the CEO or a COO in a business or a CFO, the bit I most want to know that this stuff is going to impact is my work outcome. So it is very complicated. I think that the AI is a game changer around the skills things we already said, but I just think that potential for us to become not just a support function, but to bridge across and actually understand what work outcomes and maybe to be ahead of the game of where work is going to be changing. That's the biggest piece that we've really got to try and achieve as well. And that's really hard to do as an HR professional focusing on HR process within a thing, right? You don't own that.
Yeah. It's really interesting. This is what I'm kind of hearing from just yourself, Aaron, but then also from yourself, David, is almost businesses that need to start thinking a little bit more holistically about AI. It's not just, well, the HR team, you get your budget, go and find some tools that you can sort of plug in, or as you said, CEOs thinking more holistically. Charlie, I don't want to cut you out of this because otherwise I feel like we can talk about this sort of stuff all day. So just some general thought. You can, again, free swim time for you. You can go in any direction you want. You can either talk about the skills side of it. We had the conversation about Gen AI is interesting as well, or even this idea that businesses not need to, stop being so siloed. I thought that was a fascinating example David gave about companies investing billions on AI, and you've got the HR team going, what? I mean, can we have a piece of this pie?
Yeah, well, and exactly. And linking that example back to the conversation about the skills-based organization, I think the AI element's really interesting because not only is it a great enabler to actually be able to deliver that, it's also probably in recent history the biggest impact on the skills itself. So it will not only remove a huge amount of skills that you would previously actually want to retain and attract within your organization, but it also has a huge raft of impacts on skills that organizations do not have and they need to have. So I think it comes from those two different perspectives. It's an enabler, but I think it will radically shift your skills agenda as an organization and trying to get to that skills-based model. So I think it's really interesting from both sides.
I'd like to talk a little bit around perceptions on what the vendors are doing in the market, because, and I'm happy for you guys to sort of go in any direction you want on this, because when I've been to events, I'm speaking to people, they almost feel like, and maybe this is part of the Gen AI chat as well, to be honest with you, they almost feel it's like, what are we doing with AI? Well, it's fine. The tech vendors themselves, they've got a plugin, which will be a chatbot. So that's our AI sort of tick box. Aaron, I'll start with you, if that's all right. When I thought about it, this is what you were touching on, David. It's the way of working. It's not just something that plugs into a system. It's actually the way in which work will change. If I take my own example with my team, we use Gen AI to help us to craft social media messages. And actually, it's just helped us. You put in some ideas or a blog or whatever it is, you put in some ideas, it spits out something back to you. You still need to put the human interaction in there because it doesn't quite work, but it's enabled us to be productivity. That's a way of working. That's not, let's buy a marketing platform that has some AI embedded into it. So Aaron, general sort of thoughts, and then we'll go to David on this kind of perception that AI is this tick box. If I can just bolt it in, if the vendors are doing something, then we've done our bit.
I am going to quickly defer on to David because this is his specialty and this is what Fosway do, right? They're out there talking to the providers and the products leaders a lot. So my perception and the perception that I hear now from the CPOs we talk to is that there is a lot of smoke and mirrors in the market. There are a lot of people jumping up and down going, we've got AI this, AI that, and they seem to have stuck just AI on the front of almost every paragraph that they put into their brochures. And I certainly think it's a little bit bewildering for some of the clients to work through. The practical backstop of it, I guess, is, there are lots of AI-powered chatbots coming out in various products. And, a lot of people are starting with Copilot because they've got Microsoft Teams, and that's got a big drive across an enterprise level. But if you've got a case management tool or you've got an embedded employee engagement layer in, say, so Workday, SAP, Oracle, they're all going to be pushing a chatbot agenda. And somewhere someone's got the headache of figuring out how to stack those all up and make them work. And how do you get the knowledge and the data infrastructure and architecture to work? So it's not as simple as buying a little tool out there. And almost everybody at the moment is claiming to have something, which I don't fully believe. I think there are some smoke and mirrors, and certainly it's confusing for the consumer. David, I'm sure you have a perspective on some of that.
I think one of the things around ChatGPT and Gen AI and that whole shift that happened was that every vendor, no matter how much or little they had before, has now got an AI agenda, right? Because there's always areas where they can bolt that onto activity and make it sort of make sense. I think I said earlier, there's a sort of tsunami of noise around all of this. And I think one of the things we are trying to do is to chart our way through that and understand what that really is. So every part of the stack, if you like, every part of the HR ecosystem is trying to add AI. Think about AI as in the ecosystem, not as within the system as well. So there are many There's sort of big AI and little AI and all sorts of shades in between, right? Will get embedded around here. The potential in pretty much every if I call it a silo function within HR, to use things like ChatGPT to accelerate the ability to produce things like you talked about, creating social media posts or something like that, generating job descriptions, creating interview questions, etc. There's a whole set of people activities which can be accelerated by it. There's also obviously building AI into the decision process, into personalizing the experience for every individual person, whether that's a user, an employee, or whether it's actually the function themselves in terms of how the systems can be rendered to them. We talked about skills already, and skills is almost the language of talent that we're underpinning all of these things as well. So every part of it is trying to do it. And I think there is an expectation that they can all own the problem, knowing that in reality, that's never going to be the case. And actually, from the other thing you have to really think about this is that your corporate IT function has probably also making other bets, right? So this is happening quite a lot as well. So, well, you might want to be using these AI, but in reality, we're a Microsoft shop or we're a Google shop or whatever. We will use those. And actually, I think Aaron said earlier that for most organizations, co-pilots are probably the first examples they've actually deployed in the company on a sort of transversal level. And that's still relatively early days in terms of what they're doing. So it's AI everywhere in some ways. What we have to do is to work out how that adds value in the inline process, as well as how we collectively add it up. And that's at the point where we have to start making bigger bets. That's where the HCM suites or your anchor pillar solutions become more influential. But it will be both. It will be both in the suite and in the system and in the ecosystem. And we then have to fit that, as well as maybe within the IT ecosystem as well. And it's how we put all of that jigsaw together. It's pretty complicated.
Yeah. Charlie?
Just to build on that and the points earlier around the noise and the avalanche of noise around AI, I think a word or a phrase that I really like that I've seen more about recently is AI washing. And this idea that now we've been deluged so much with AI features, it being badged everywhere, that consumers and organizations especially are starting to be more clued up to where it is AI as a badge rather than it is something distinctly new, or I'm being given something that actually a few years ago wasn't possible. So I think we're likely to see more of that as a trend throughout, especially the next year or two, as organizations working out what is AI washing and what is genuinely something that's transformative. And I think just building on David's point there is when it comes to organizations listening to this and thinking about exploring AI, when it comes to AI, or even a few years back, or some organizations still looking at it, moving to the cloud, they should be looking at AI and bringing it back to the why. Why are we doing it? What problem are we trying to solve within our HR function, but also for our business? Is it productivity? Is it how do we scale without increasing headcount? Is it cost saving or headcount saving? If you'll bring it back to the why, then you'll actually be exploring AI for the right reasons, not just, I think, as we talked about, I'm being tasked, or I think I need to go out and get a new AI tool. I need to roll out some functionality. There needs to be a real driver behind it. What's the value creation for your function and for your business? And what we talked about, the workforce, how's it going to benefit the employee and the employee experience overall? I think that's the most important thing to anchor all of these discussions back to.
Cool. David, I just want to grab your final sort of thoughts. We're just on about 30 minutes, but any kind of final thoughts you wanted to build on with Charlie's point there?
Thought is you need a lot longer. 30 minutes to discuss it.
Yeah,
I actually thought that Charlie referred to the cloud there, and I think there's a very interesting parallel. And I mentioned this actually when we did the workshop, is that pretty much every corporate was late to the cloud, right? The vendors already started to make that shift. They'd already deployed certain solutions before they realized they had to create governance for them. And in most cases, when they looked at what they were doing on their own systems, they were worse than what they were doing when they're with these new cloud systems. And we had to play catch up very quickly. The other side of this is, to some degree, I would say, is if you now look at the cloud in the HR technology space, what choice have you got? Unless you're living in the dark ages or saying with a system that's living in the dark ages, in reality, you pretty much had to make that transition. There is a degree that shift is kind of happening to you. You're not in control of it. I think that's also a risk, is that we assume you can control that as well. You definitely need to have controls in place and governance and things like this. You need to be making conscious decisions about where you want to apply it. But a lot of this is going to happen anyway. There isn't a way back to before that, especially if we can work out the cost and funding, the economic model underneath it. The impact of this is too big. And at the end of the day, your business is probably shifting faster than your HR function is. If that's the case, we have to work out how we ride that wave, right? And do that in a positive way. And there will be winners and losers in that debate.
Yeah, absolutely. Aaron, we're just about to wrap up. Any kind of final thoughts or any bits you want to just leave our listeners with before we depart for today?
We haven't talked about Charlie's favourite topic, so I think we can do that on another podcast around regulation, because I think that is one thing we haven't talked about, and it's always surprises me how few of the organizations we talk to still haven't really got their heads around even things like policies, let alone how to manage risk, legal risk around bias and all the things that David talked about as well. So there's a whole section there, I think, worth investigating and talking around and data ethics and all those sort of lovely topics. I was just smiling to myself thinking that's another way to keep cool. We started with a keep cool at the start. Ride the tsunami. That's the way to stay cool as you go through this. But certainly I think, if you think this is going to happen in the next 5 years and the next 10 years, you're wrong. It's happening now. It's going on around you. And this point that David has raised around what does work look like for your business is probably the one question I would be asking as an HR professional right now on the back of generative AI.
Yeah, I really love that kind of as a bookend to today's podcast. It's, what does work look like? Focusing on the work rather than the snazzy tool, how's it impacting HR? Think holistically about the whole business and think about it as work. David, thank you very much for joining us for today's pod. I've got a feeling that we'll need to bring you back on again because 30 minutes just hasn't been enough. As Aaron said, we've got loads more to get through, but thank you very much.
Thank you.
Aaron, as always, pleasure to have you on.
Lovely. Thank you.
And last but not least, Charlie. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you as always, Chris.
You can, of course, get this podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Just search for HR on the Offensive. You can see our entire back catalogue. You can also access that via the Lace Partners website, lacepartners.co.uk/podcast. If you go on our main website and go to the Insights section, quite often what we do with some of these topics, we will turn them into written pieces as well, or live streaming as well. I think I'm going to message Charlie and do maybe a little live stream on AI washing, because that sounded quite interesting. But from myself, from David, from Charlie, and from Aaron, thank you very much for listening. Hopefully we'll catch you next time on the HR on the Offensive podcast. Bye-bye.